Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session today where we'll be discussing the CARES Act loan forgiveness application. Now, just to make sure that we are all on the same page, I want to go over some basics just to ensure that everyone here has an awareness of how things are where we are today. Now, as you all know, we had a pandemic that hit. The federal government issued the CARES Act. Within the CARES Act, there was what is called the Payment Protection Program, which most of us are aware of, also known as the PPP. This allowed for you to get a loan through an approved SBA bank. It was for small business companies. You were then allowed to take these funds and pay payroll, the majority of which needed to be no less than 75%. And then the remaining 25% could be used for rent, debt obligations, and utilities. Okay, now, of course, what I mentioned, those things, there is also the forgiveness aspect. Many people weren't aware that using these funds through a loan meant you automatically, in the manner which you're supposed to, automatically got you that loan forgiven. That was not the case. You actually had to apply for the loan forgiveness. Now, the federal government did recently issue the application for people to get started on working on that application. Now, of course, you really can't submit your loan forgiveness application until the completion of the time frame. Okay, the time frame started either when you got the loan or on an alternate date on when your first payroll came after the loan. All right. What I'm going to do now is we're going to go ahead. We're going to get started the presentation because in addition to those topics I just mentioned, there have been some changes that have taken place. So it's very important that we're aware of these changes because in many cases, these changes may be impacting your forgiveness application and the amount of PPP loan that will be forgiven. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Before we get into the application, let me just introduce myself. Let me jump to the next. My name is Senan Garcia. For those who don't know, I am an attorney. I focus on mergers and acquisitions as well as tax matters. I've actually been speaking about the CARES Act and the Payment Protection Program, and to a lesser extent, the EIDL, also known as the SBA grant loan application, as well as the SBA loan for disaster purposes. With the SBA and to an extent with the SBDC and with various municipalities. I've been studying the acts. I've also been studying the recent acts that came through, which we'll be discussing later today. Of course, if you have any questions regarding what we talk about today, you are more than welcome to let me know. At the end of the presentation, there will be a link where you can jot down and then send me all your questions and concerns there regarding the loan forgiveness. All right. So as mentioned, here are our topics. We're going to be discussing updates to loan forgiveness, gathering the information for the application that you'll need, filling, of course, the application out, calculating the loan forgiveness aspect, and then, of course, we're going to try a few examples that may apply to you. And keep in mind, these are just a few examples. They in no way, shape, or form are limited to these scenarios. There could be a multitude of scenarios that is applicable to your scenario. So, your case, I should say. So let's get started. So up till now, what we were aware of was the loan forgiveness only worked for up to 8 weeks total. It either started when the loan originated or, again, when your first payroll hit. And again, as we said, it was up to 75%. Right? So there have been changes to that. Now, one of the adjustments that did come down from the interim rules that took place prior to the PPP Adjustment Act that came down, and I apologize for the name of the act. I can't remember the exact name, and quite frankly, it's not as important as what was in the act. there were some changes regarding owners. Now, you were always capped at $100,000 per employee. All right, that was always the case with the PPP. You could not exceed $100,000 per employee as far as the forgiveness went. So if you paid anybody the equivalent of more than $100,000 for a particular year, the forgiveness would only take into account up to $100,000. Any amounts paid after that would be part of the loan you'd have to pay back. Okay, presuming you did so. With respect to owner employees, the same rules had applied. That changed. Now, according to the interim rules, the final interim rules that came down just before the new act came down, owner employees or self-employed individuals were capped at 100. We knew this already. Or were capped at the amount they made in 2019. For the case of self-employed, such as a Schedule C, you look to your profits. Owner employee, you look to your salary. If your salary was $50,000 and you're making the equivalent of, let's say, $75,000, well, you're going to be limited from the forgiveness standpoint to the $60,000. Okay, so it's the lesser of what you received in 2019 or $100,000. Okay, the cap. So just keep that in mind when you're calculating this. If you happen to have given yourself a raise this year as an owner employee, on the employee side, you're obviously not going to be able to take advantage of that raise. You're going to have to base it on what you made in 2019. And the amounts here are the $1,923.08 is the equivalent amount for 1 week's worth of $100,000. So obviously 8 weeks times the $1,923.08 would be your cap, or 8-week period. So you take the total salary, divide it by 52, multiply times 8. That will be your 29, based on your 2019 salary. Compare the two, whichever is lower, that's going to be your cap. All right. Now, getting to the act that changed things. As I mentioned, originally it was 8 weeks, meaning you had 8 weeks to use these funds for forgiveness purposes. And then, of course, anything that exceeded the 8 weeks that you were not able to use, those amounts will have to be paid back. Okay, it wouldn't be part of the loan forgiveness. What the act did, first of all, is it changed that. It expanded it to 24 weeks. It took into account a lot of complaints that a lot of business owners were having, where they were basically saying, we have not been able to hire employees. We haven't been able to do a lot of things. It's not fair to us. Therefore, we need more time to utilize these funds. So Congress did that. The president signed it. So now instead of 8 weeks, you have 24 weeks. All right. In addition to that, the 75% minimum requirement for payroll costs was reduced to 60%, meaning, of course, the opposite, that 40%, up to 40% of the funds could be used for non-payroll costs, such as rent, debt obligations, and utilities. All right. Now, that the remaining aspects did not change. The forgiveness amount is considered canceled. As to you, the SBA will take over those payments and make the payments on your behalf to the banks. It will not be treated as a cancellation of debt, so you don't have to worry about having to report these funds later on, and the amount will not be reported to credit reporting agencies. Now, before we get into this, one quick note. Any amounts that were used, this is another change that came down, well, not change, but a clarification. Any amounts that were used for payment of payroll and non-payroll costs that emanated from the PPP loan that will be forgiven, okay, as well as the loan advance or the idle grant, however you want to call it. Any of these, either of these programs, if they were used to pay expenses and you ultimately get them forgiven, in the case of the grant, you don't have to pay it back, you cannot deduct those expenses. Okay, so again, any amounts that you're ultimately forgiven cannot be a deductible expense for your business. Any amount in the grant that is used, those funds cannot be used for deduction. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So for the loan forgiveness itself, As mentioned at the very beginning, you must apply for the forgiveness. Now, you have to apply through the bank. So you don't apply to the SBA directly. You don't apply to the IRS. You apply with your bank, the bank that issued you the PPP loan in the first place. Okay. I would recommend to get in touch with your bank if they have not gotten in touch with you already. I know some banks have had submitted early on their application process and have now kind of rescinded that in light of the new legislation that came down. So you want to stay in touch with them. You want to work with them on the application process so that you're familiar with it, familiar with how they're going to handle it, so that you have everything you need. Of course, in order to get the loan application, you need to fill out the application for loan forgiveness. This is different from the PPP loan application. Okay, completely different applications. Okay, and it's available online. You can go check out a copy. You should be able to find one on SBA.gov or even Google, and you should be able to pull a copy of the PPP loan forgiveness application. Of course, you'll need to be prepared to provide documentation verifying the numbers within the loan forgiveness application. Some of those can be payroll tax filings, state income tax filings, payroll, unemployment insurance, documentation such as canceled checks, payment receipts, transcripts. When it comes to the non-payroll costs, remember that all of those obligations must have been in existence prior to February 15th of 2020. So if you had a lease, the lease had to have already been signed prior to February 15, 2020. Copy of the lease would be one of the proving documents. Utility bills would be part of those documents. Again, you had to have had those utilities in place prior to February 15, 2020. Same goes for the debt obligation. Just show copies of the documentations regarding any debts that you're paying. Okay, and then of course, you're going to need to submit a certification from a representative of the company authorized to make such certifications. And of course, everything is true and correct, of course, with any documentation or penalties of perjury. So make sure that you've provided all the documentations and they are correct to the best of your knowledge. So when you are preparing the application, when you're preparing to get a loan forgiveness, obviously you want to get the loan application from the bank. They'll usually provide, and what they're going to likely do is they're going to provide an online link where you can submit all the information. Most likely it will be pre-calculated in certain aspects, so you don't have to worry about calculating anything. In our exercise, we will be using a calculation that I created to assist you. But the good news is that most banks should be providing you an online platform. If they do not, and they provide you a written form that you'll have to fill out, or you can't do it online, you have to do it written form. Hopefully, what we discussed today should be able to assist you in that regard. Again, you want to get in touch with your payroll companies if you have one, or obtain the payroll data regarding your 941s, your 940s, your RCT6s. If you, again, use a payroll company, ADP, Paychex, whichever the case may be. All right, and if you're going to be, or if you've used the PPP funds to pay for fringe benefits such as health insurance, make sure to have the documentation in order, payment receipts, canceled checks, account statements, things of that sort. Other fringe benefits, any contributions to retirement plans, same thing goes as far as proof. Any local and state taxes that are assessed on employees, if you have state income taxes in your area, make sure you have the documentation that proves the state taxes that were paid on their behalf. Okay. You'll also need your EIDL loan information, specifically the loan advance that you received, if you did receive such an advance. Okay. And the same thing goes for your lease and rental. Make sure you have a copy of the agreement so you can submit that if you're including that with the loan forgiveness application. Debt obligation, same thing. Utility, as we mentioned. And then, of course, if you used any calculations with respect to calculating the PPP, any forms and whatnot, you'll need those as well. So when you start the application, we're going to get into first the aspect that doesn't involve calculations. So you'll want to start obviously with your legal name. Okay, this may be different from your DBA or your marketing name, your legal name as it appears in your tax return. Obviously your business address, your employer identification number, which isn't listed here, which you'd also need. Contact information for the business, which isn't listed, but you'll also need that. Your SBA PPP loan number, your lender PPP loan number and your PPP loan amount. Very important. The SBA has a PPP loan number that was issued for the PPP. Your lender, the bank that issued you the PPP funds, will have their own loan number. It's very important you get both. Okay, not one, not the other, both. And if you have proper documentation from your lender, and they should have it, they should be able to provide these numbers to you without an issue, along with the PPP loan amount if you do not recall what it is. You'll also need to provide the number of employees at the time when the loan origination took place, and then of course the number of employees at the time of the forgiveness, meaning after, of course, in this case now 24 weeks is up. You'll need to provide how often you paid everyone. Biweekly as an example. It could be twice a month, monthly, other, whatever the case may be. The covered period. As I mentioned, the covered period is either one of two. It's either when you started getting your first payroll after you got the loan, 24 weeks thereafter, or the loan origination date itself, 24 weeks thereafter. Okay. If you use your payroll, your first payroll after loan origination date, that would be your alternate, that would be considered an alternate period. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And then of course, your loan disbursement date, which we just mentioned, you should be able to get that from your bank. All right, and then if you did apply for the loan advance or the EIDL, you'll want to provide that information. Now, for the calculation itself, you'll need the application, of course. You're going to need a form, what is called Schedule A, that accompanies the application, and then 2 worksheets, tables 1 and 2, that appear on the one sheet itself. So in reality, 3 sheets you should have in order to prepare it, but they're technically 4 forms. Okay. Now, in order to apply and work this out, one of the things I've learned is you want to start with your worksheets first, then move to your Schedule A, and then finally with the application itself. Believe it or not, it actually works better that way. So when you're starting with your calculations, don't start with the main loan application form, because you're going to find that a lot of things there you don't have, or you're going to need to calculate. The bare basic forms are going to start at the back. So we're going to get into 3 scenarios. Okay, one of them being a company with just payroll, rent, utility, nothing out of the ordinary. Scenario number 2 with company with payroll, mortgage, and wage reduction. And then scenario number 3, company with payroll with a full-time employee reduction. Again, there are various scenarios. Okay, so these are just 3 examples of scenarios. In scenario number 3, it's going to be a little bit nuanced. When I first created that scenario, it was under the guise of a situation where you would have 8 weeks. Obviously now there's 24 weeks, and now you're going to see how that may not impact you as much because of the 24 weeks, which was partially the intention of the 24 weeks, was to ensure that as many people did not have to pay back the PPP for the loan forgiveness amount. So we're going to get started with our first scenario. What's going to happen is I'm going to switch out from the PowerPoint for the purposes of the rest of the scenarios through our Excel spreadsheet. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you the scenarios 2 and 3. But for now, I'm just going to read through scenario 1 so you can see it. Its loan amount is $26,000, so that's what they got for the loan. The payroll for the period is $58,800. They had 2 employees at the start of the application, 2 employees at the time of the forgiveness. Each employee worked 40 hours a week during the 24-week period. Employee 1 was paid $30,000 for the 24 weeks. Employee 2 was paid $28,000. Rent for the 24 period was $35,000, and utilities for the 24-week period was $3,000. So we are now in the application, or I should say the calculation spreadsheet that I had created for the purposes of this presentation. Right now, we are looking at the calculations that would be in your loan forgiveness application. Now, I'm going to go down, and actually, I just realized you don't have, yes, you still are connected, so you should still see the screen. Perfect. Okay. Apologies for the technical difficulties on that one. That was on me. So this is the loan forgiveness application. This next tab is for the Schedule A that I was referring to, and then the final one is the PPP worksheets, where we're going to actually get started. So As we mentioned, you're going to need to input the employee information. So we're going to start right here. So we have employee names. In this case, obviously you want to have the employee names. I'm just going to name them John and Jane Doe. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then Jane Doe for the other one. Now, of course, we would need their social security numbers. I'm just going to go ahead and put in a random social security number. Of course, you would have this information, so this is not something that if you should have any difficulty. Now, since we had that from the interim final rules, the cap on owners, it's important to know if they are owners or not. So this column for owners is actually an input that I created. Okay, it's to kind of give a little bit of an ease. So we have not been given any information that they are owners, so we're going to presume that they are not owners. All right, now, cash compensation. Now, in this case, we were told that they received $30,000 for employee 1, $28,800 for employee 2. Keep in mind, cash compensation is not limited to these amounts. Cash compensation, believe it or not, can be obviously gross salary wages, but it can also be payments for cash, tip, or equivalents, payment for vacation, parental, family, medical, or sick leave, allowances for dismissal or separation, and bonus and hazard pay. So cash compensation can include all of this. Obviously, in our scenario, it's just the $30,000 and the $28,000. So we're going to go ahead and put $30,000. We're going to go ahead and put $28,800. Now, we were already told that we had 2 employees to start and 2 employees at the end, and they both worked 40 hours per week during the 24-week period. So what you would do this is you would divide the number of hours worked divided by 40. It's always divided by 40. So in this case, it's 1. And we do the same thing since, again, we both know that they are both worked 40 hours divided by the total number of hours for a week, which is 40. We weren't given any information that there was a reduction in pay, so this is going to be 0. And you'll notice there is another kind of worksheet towards the right. We're going to leave that for the scenario where it's applied. It doesn't apply here because as you notice, it's talking about owner-employee calculation. We don't have any owners, so we're not going to get there. We also didn't have employees that generated more than 100,000, so we're not going to be looking at table 2. All right. So moving right along, we have now our information here from, and we've completed our worksheets for the PPP. Now we're going to move on to the Schedule A. You'll notice that we've already moved in line 1, which is enter the compensation from box 1 in worksheet table 1. We've entered in the number of employees tier 2. Now we get into the other box. And just so you know, the blue boxes are where we enter everything in that doesn't have a blue box is a pre-calculated amount. So, and that should help you in terms of when you're filling this out, you'll notice that there aren't many boxes where you have to actually fill in raw numbers. A lot of it is just calculation, looking back at the previous number and coming up with something. So lines 6, 7, and 8 deal with employee contributions for health insurance, retirement, and taxes. We're going to presume that there are no taxes, that they weren't given health, we weren't given any information otherwise, so we're going to presume they're all 0. We did not have any owner employees, so this is going to be 0. And then the average number of full-time employees during the chosen period, we had 2, which we again got from our number here. So our equivalent quotient is 1. Okay, and it's going to basically take the amount on 2 divided by 1. All right. Now, finally, we get into our loan forgiveness application. Once again, we had the $58,800 pre-filled in. There were no real debt obligations here. However, we did have $35,000 in rent, and we did have $3,000 in utility. I told you at the beginning that the loan amount was $26,000. You'll already notice that I already reduced it to 60%. So what'll happen is once you get to this screen, it's going to take 3 numbers. It's going to actually take your modified total, which is taking the payroll for the entire period, your rent, and your utilities, which ultimately came down to $96,800. your loan amount, $26,000, and then 60% of payroll costs, which is $98,000 even. And then you are going to be given the forgiveness of the smallest of the three. In this case, the smallest of the three is the loan amount. So in this scenario, the entire loan is forgiven. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this information so that we can prepare for scenario number 2. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave Jane Doe and John Doe's information there. If we need to change anything, we'll bring that in at that point. So I'm going to go ahead and read to you scenario 2 so we are not jumping around. The loan amount in scenario 2 is $114,000. The payroll for the period was $85,002. Once again, we had 2 employees at the start of the application and 2 employees at the end of the application. Each employee worked 40 hours during the 24-week period. Employee 2, however, had a reduction in wages from 16 weekly to 11 weekly for the 24-week period. And employee 1's salary was $46,602 for the 24-week period. Rent was $40,000. We presume in this case that utilities maybe was factored into rent. So let's get started. We don't have any information that anyone is an owner employee. So obviously we're not going to be able to figure this scenario out. So we'll presume that there neither is an owner. Okay. Once again, the only cash compensation that we see here that they actually received in the case of employee number 1 during the period was $46,602. They did work 40 hours during the 40-hour period, and there was no wage reduction. In the case of employee number 2, they got $1,100 per week for 24 weeks. They were also a full-time employee for the 24-week period. However, there was a reduction. There was a reduction from $1,600 to $1,100. So that's about a $500 reduction per week. So we have $500 per week times 24. There was a reduction in $12,000. All right. We didn't have any employees that made more than $100,000. We had 2 full-time employees. We didn't have any owner-employee compensation. There's nothing to calculate there. So now we move here. We weren't given any information as far as employee health insurance or retirement or local taxes. We also, again, know that we didn't have any owner-employees, so that's 0. Once again, we had 2 full-time employees. So again, our quotient is 1. Now, just so you understand about the quotient, if the quotient is less than 1, that amount may be reduced. Okay, that would reduce theoretically the amount of loan. Okay, so keep that in mind when it comes to calculating. Okay. All right. Well, it would reduce obviously the loan forgiveness. So let's get to our options here. We don't have any debt obligations. We were told that the rent is $40,000. We weren't giving any information as far as utilities. And I told you from the beginning that we had a loan amount of $114,000. So we obviously have our modified total, which totals up our payroll costs and our business rent payments. It was reduced by the reduction amount, which was the $12,000. And we have our modified total of $101,002. The PPP loan amount itself was $114,000. And the payroll percentage of the PPP that was issued was $121,670. So the smallest of the 3 was actually the modified amount, which is $101,002. So in this scenario, they're going to be forgiven $101,002. The remaining balance will have to be paid back. Now, they did in the act, the recent act, it was at one point you had to pay back whatever wasn't forgiven in 2 years at 1% interest. It's now been extended to 5 years. Okay, so there's more time to pay it back. So if you're in this scenario, the remaining balance, you would have to pay it back, but you have time to pay it back. All right. And once again, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to eliminate these figures so that we can do our final scenario. Once again, I'm going to leave the information regarding employees so we don't have to go into that, so that doesn't involve much in calculations. All right, scenario number 3, our final scenario. Loan amount is $30,400. Payroll for the period was $68,400. Again, we had 2 employees at the start of the application, 2 employees at the time of forgiveness. Now, employee 1 had hours decreased during the from 40 hours per week to 28 hours per week during the 24-week period. Employee 1 was paid $30,000 during the 24-week period. Employee number 2 is an owner employee, was paid a salary of $38,400 for the 24-week period, and in 2019 received a salary of $70,000. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So, employee number 1, they're not an owner. So we're going to go no. Their cash compensation was $30,000. Great. However, they had hours reduced. So we write the number of hours they had, which is 28, divided by 40, because they were reduced from 40 to 28 hours. There was no salary wage reductions that we can know of. There most likely was. For the purposes of this exercise, we're going to presume that there was no salary reduction, even though hours reduced. Hours reduced likely means there was a salary reduction. But this is so you understand the concept of the reduction in the full-time employees. Employee number 2 is an owner. So what does that mean? We're not going to actually use the remaining aspects of this spreadsheet. We're going to jump over to this spreadsheet, this worksheet tablet, so to speak. Now, in this case, we're going to enter in the 24-week period compensation, which is $38,400. Their 2019 equivalent, which is 70. It's already less than 100,000, so we don't have to worry about that restriction. So now we write the maximum amount of loan forgiveness. We don't really have, it's 100,000 in this particular case, but I have to put it anyway. So what do we know? Which is going to be the smallest of the 3? It's actually going to be the 2019 equivalent. So even though this is what they received, this is the amount of money that's going to be put into the calculation. So now we're complete with respect to, now the only thing you need to fill out here with regarding Jane Doe is the full-time status, because obviously they were an employee and they had full-time employment status during that time period. So now we're going to jump to Schedule A. Now in Schedule A, we had $30,000 for our employee 1. There was no health insurance. There was no retirement. There was no local taxes assessed, but there was an amount given to the owner employee. So we're going to go ahead. We're going to grab that amount, and we're going to put that in there. Now, number of employees, the average number of full-time employees during the borrower's reference period is going to be 2, okay? Because that was what they had from the start. Notice what it did to the FD reduction quotient. Instead of being 1-to-1, now it's at 0.85. So that's going to cause a reduction. Now let's see how that impacts them, especially factoring in the new rules. There's no debt obligations that we were communicated. There was rent of $40,000. No utilities to speak of. The loan amount was $30,400. Interesting scenario here. They still get the full forgiveness amount. Why? They got it because of the change in the law. Had this scenario been different, meaning prior to the change, if it was 75% in 8 weeks, what you would have found is that there would have been a reduction in the loan forgiveness. But due to the 24-week expansion, this company was able to forgive the entire balance. I highlight this because I want to gauge a point to you that many of you may have been worried that you would not be able to get the full loan, the PPP loan amount forgiven. This example is to show you that the likelihood is you'll be able to do so now. If you're not 100% sure, obviously work with your bank. You can give us a call. We'll be glad to go over your scenario to see, in fact, if you do qualify for full loan forgiveness based on the new law. Now, some people may still have to pay back their loans after the 24-week period. Okay, and that's perfectly fine. What the law did was it got individuals that were kind of in that scenario where it wasn't probably fair because they were doing what they were supposed to do, but they couldn't get the loans. This helps them in that scenario. All right. I'm going to go ahead and switch back to our presentation. All right. And this concludes our presentation regarding the PPP loan forgiveness application. I'm sure many of you no longer are in a hurry to get the loan forgiveness application done due to the fact that the 8 weeks have been expanded to 24 weeks. Okay, so you do have a lot more time to get everything in. So if you're not looking at it now, but you do have questions, let us know. We'll be glad to work with you on any of the questions and concerns that you have. And you can reach us at this link, www.sgarcialaw.com/loan info. Okay, you can just submit whatever questions, concerns, comments that you wish to have, and we will be glad to answer them as quickly as possible. So with that said, I wish you all the best. Good luck. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I hope all is well with you. If you have any questions, any concerns, whatever the case may be, give us a call. We'll be glad to help. Good luck, and hopefully your businesses are back up and running and are doing well.